Hi everybody. In this lecture we will be covering the topic of the peripheral nervous system and then end with a discussion of reflexes. And I'm going to go back to indicating when I have finished talking about a slide with a little star, which did not work because that just moved the slide, so here's your little star. The first topic we'll be covering in this area are the cranial nerves. Because we've already covered the cranial nerves in lab, I'm not going to be asking you to re-test on all of these things again. What I would like you to know is, why are they cranial nerves? And they are cranial nerves because they originate from the brain, and there is an exception to that, which we will talk about in a minute, that there are 12 of them, that they all form pairs, and I'm just going to cross this section out for now because we will cover that on the next few slides. So one of the two cranial nerves I will ask you about, and that's because to me this is one of the most important ones, is the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10, which is what that X means. So this is the only cranial nerve that leaves the head and neck region. Only cranial nerve to leave head, neck region. And what it does is provide sensory and parasympathetic motor control of the visceral organs. Sensory input and motor output, which is primarily going to be parasympathetic to visceral organs, which again, visceral organs are the organs that are found within the interior body cavities, so the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. The other cranial nerve that I would like to highlight is the accessory nerve, and that's because this is the only cranial nerve that originates outside the brain. Other than that, it is very similar to the rest of the cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 11 specifically controlling the muscles of the neck and upper back. Which you can see in the diagram with it innervating the trapezius muscle at the sternocleidomastoid. What we will cover next are the spinal nerves. So spinal nerves we didn't really talk about in lab. There are 31 pairs of them. And each spinal nerve is mixed function, containing both sensory and motor nerves. Which, if you remember back to the lecture about spinal cord anatomy, should make sense because the dorsal root and the ventral root, dorsal root contains sensory information, dorsal root contains sensory information, ventral root contains motor information. They combine together to form a spinal nerve, and so each one is mixed function. The spinal nerves are numbered after the vertebrae that they are closely associated with. You can see there are only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. That's because within the cervical nerves, they're named after vertebrae below them until they get to C7, in which the C8 spinal nerve is below cervical vertebrae 7. So this is vertebrae, this is spinal nerve. And then the rest of the way down, it is basically the spinal nerve is named after the vertebrae above it. So named after superior vertebrae. And this holds true all the way down to the coccygeal nerve number 1, which comes out at the coccyx. So typically 1 to 2 centimeters long total. And they're formed from the dorsal root and ventral root. So here's our spinal cord over within the vertebral foramen. So you've got the dorsal root would come out and then go through the intervertebral foramen. You would then have the ventral root coming out here, joining with the dorsal root, combining together. And so this segment right here is going to be the spinal nerve. Once they've left the vertebral foramen, they diverge again. And so then you get a dorsal rami and a ventral rami. But at this point, the rami are actually mixed function. So the combination that occurs in the spinal nerve of the dorsal root and ventral root continues as you go into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. And I'm doing plural for writing, although I'm saying singular. So the spinal nerves that leave the spinal cord between C1 and T2, and then again from L1 through the coccygeal spinal nerve, form nerve plexuses. So a nerve plexus is one where you have a mixture of nerves crisscrossing each other. So if we have C1, C2, C3, and I'll follow these with colors, you can see C2 would go out and crisscross, basically making it a big jumble of different nerve fibers. And so if you look within these regions, basically the structure of plexus is where you have the combination and then separation of nerve fibers as they move out towards their target tissue. The thoracic nerves between T3 and T12 are form a structure called segmental connections, in which, so if you have your spinal nerve, spinal cord, segmental connections mean that there's no networking, so that the one that's superior does not cross with the spinal nerve inferior to it. So this is segmental. So think of it as segments of the body. So you could basically take a slice out of the body, and the nerve fibers from that region will all come off the one section. Whereas if there's a plexus, you're going to have nerve fibers coming from up and below and combining together. So that's a plexus. Plexus is, maybe I'll just make it a singular, plexus. So this is going to be a thought question based on the last couple lectures. So this image is of spinal nerve C6, which connects to the brachial plexus, which then innervates the arm. What general function would be lost if the axons were severed at this point right here? So this is in the dorsal root. So I will give you a star to think about it. So dorsal root is sensory fibers. So you would lose the ability to feel any information coming from that region, sensory fibers. And since I gave you the fact that it is from the brachial plexus, that tells you that there's some region of the arm. So you would not be able to feel some region of your arm. The last topic for this lecture is going to be spinal reflexes, combining both the central nervous system with the spinal cord with the peripheral nervous system with nerve fibers going out. A reflex is defined as an automatic response to a stimulus. Reflexes can be mediated by either the spinal cord or the brain, so it does not mean always spinal cord. And reflexes can sometimes be innate, but they can also be learned. We'll specifically be talking about spinal reflexes at this point, which are just adding in the fact that this is an automatic response to a stimulus that's mediated by the spinal cord specifically. There are multiple types of spinal reflex. So the first type that we'll discuss is a somatic reflex, which activates skeletal muscles. And usually anytime you hear the word somatic means body. This tends to be the voluntary component of the body, so things that we can think about and control, so skeletal muscles. There are also visceral reflexes. So visceral reflexes, instead of activating skeletal muscle, activate smooth muscles. Or the other class of muscle that is also involuntary, which is cardiac muscles. Or even creates the stimulation that leads to gland secretion. So, and glands. The response in this picture is showing the emetic reflex, which is vomiting. And I'm not going to ask you about the detail of this, but just know this is actually something that's a very complex system that has a lot of different levels of control and a lot of different activities. And there's an entire division of the Society of Neuroscience dedicated to understanding how we control our emetic reflex. So the components of a reflex arc, when we're talking about a spinal cord, includes the receptor, which is going to detect the stimulus, the sensory neuron, which is also the afferent neuron that passes up through the dorsal root. This is where the dorsal root ganglia would be, into the dorsal horn, where it then synapses with an interneuron, which creates the integration center, taking input from one or more neurons and making the decision of whether or not to initiate a response. If a response is initiated, that signal is then sent out through the motor neuron to then impact the effector, which gives us the response. So there are multiple levels of complexity of spinal reflexes. The simpler ones are monosynaptic reflexes, in which you have one sensory neuron that then synapses directly to a motor neuron. So there's no interneuron to have any sort of integration. It's sort of input and output are directly linked. These are very fast and do not allow for much variation in control. Polysynaptic reflexes are ones that allow for more complex responses. So it allows for complexity of response. And so in these polysynaptic, so poly means many, you have a sensory neuron, sends its efferent fiber into the spinal cord. You then have one or more interneurons. That then synapse with a motor neuron. So it's polysynaptic because there's more than one synapse, the minimum number being 2. And we will talk through the example that's illustrated over here in a second. One of the most basic types of reflexes is called the flexor reflex. And this type of reflex withdraws our body from painful stimulus. So what characterizes flexor reflex is that it's ipsilateral, which just means it's occurring on the same side of the body as the stimulus. They tend to be polysynaptic so that we can have some more complex control over it. Which you can see here, we've got an interneuron, so that makes it polysynaptic. It tends to be one of the most dominant of reflexes. So it overrides other spinal reflexes, which makes sense because you want to make sure that if there is a painful stimulus that you get your body out of harm's way. But that being said, it can still be overridden by the brain. Which also makes evolutionary sense, because if you think about, like, if you're holding a baby, you don't want to drop the baby in the fire because you feel painful stimulus. You want to actually be in control and move the baby out of the way carefully. The more complex polysynaptic reflex that we saw earlier is called the crossed extensor reflex. And the crossed extensor reflex is one where you have the stimulus on one side of the body that then sends a signal up into the spinal cord. It then sends signals to both sides, so both the ipsilateral side, which is the same side, and the contralateral side, initiating both the flexion and an extension. And I'll talk a little bit more on the other side, but take a minute to look through this diagram and understand what's happening. So, in summary of what crossed extensor reflex does is it gives you ipsilateral withdrawal. So it will pull you away from the toxic stimulus or harmful stimulus on the same side of the body, but then gives you contralateral or opposite side of the body extension. Which, if you're doing something like stepping on something sharp, makes sense. You want to flex away from the painful stimulus, and since your body weight is now being transferred over to the opposite limb, you want to extend that limb to help hold the additional body weight that's being exposed to it. Our bodies also have a variety of superficial reflexes, which can be elicited by gentle cutaneous stimulation. A lot of these don't have any functional use in terms of everyday living, but they are really good ways for medical professionals to assess upper motor pathways and spinal cord reflexes. One of the fairly simple ones is called the plantar reflex, in which the practitioner will run a blunt probe from the heel up across the lateral border of the foot and then medially towards the big toe. And in healthy adults, what this results in is the plantar flexion, meaning that your toes sort of curl over on themselves. What happens if you do the same test in a newborn, so somebody that's under 1 year old, you'll get what's called Babinski's sign. So instead of plantar flexion, you actually get dorsiflexion. Plus big toe abduction. So instead of sort of scrunching over, the foot flares. So if you have access to a baby that's under a year old, I would definitely try experimenting with this. what it indicates is that there's been incomplete myelination, or is still incomplete myelination, that is still developing in a newborn. If you get the same sort of sign in an adult, so if you can see Babinski's sign in an adult, what this indicates is corticospinal damage, meaning that the motor control or control and sensation of the foot is not properly wired anymore. The last of these is called the abdominal reflex. And so the abdominal reflex is you stroke the skin near the umbilicus, and the umbilicus will then sort of twitch slightly towards that stimulus. And I've looked a lot for, so basically if you run a probe like this, the umbilicus will twitch, so your belly button will twitch towards it. This sounded like a really cool reflex that I wanted to see, but when I looked for YouTube videos of it, I couldn't find any good illustrations of it. It's not a very strong reflex, but it's still medically important because it checks for the integrity of the spinal cord. So if you don't have it, your spinal cord may be severed. Or you could just be stressed out and clenching your belly. Probably most useful in unconscious victims. And it also tests for the integrity of the ventral rami in between the thoracic spinal nerves T8 and T12. So basically, has this person had some pretty serious back injury or not?